Welcome back to another video lecture with Mr. King. The purpose of this lecture will be to trace the developments of the 1930s that led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. And we're not going to really get to the United States involvement just yet, but I thought it was important that we have at least some background into the causes and explanations of World War II. And I think you'll see, or you might remember, that World War I, it was very difficult to really pin blame on any one nation for the outbreak of that war and conflict. And I think this time around with World War II, it's a very different picture. You may have studied some of this in the past, which is great. Any prior knowledge is always helpful and most welcome. So any questions you have, please jot them down, bring them to class, and we will get started. And we're going to start with, as you see up here on the screen, the Great Depression and the crash of 1929, the stock market crash, and the Great Depression. And you might wonder why and what connection that would have to World War II. And that would be a very good question. But it is the reality of the Great Depression that really brought the world's economies to their knees and caused a lot of suffering and misery. And it really caused governments, and the United States is a prime example of this, to refocus their efforts on helping people, relieving their suffering at home. And so domestic politics and policies took precedence over world affairs. And that's really troubling, because the United States, despite the common myth that we were an isolationist country that turned our back on world affairs at the end of World War I, by rejecting Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, the United States had really been involved in the world in a very significant way. And I've listed just three of the initiatives that the United States was involved in the 1920s. And all of these initiatives were in some way designed to promote world peace and prosperity. So the first thing the United States did in the early 1920s was a series of naval arms treaties that restricted the number of battleships each nation could have. So each nation was assigned a certain number of battleships. And that was to limit the idea of an arms race. And it was quite effective in reality. However, by the time we get to the Depression and the great crash that caused that, in part, countries are going to pay less attention to this. Now, you might think, well, that's not a big deal. Countries don't have enough money. How are they possibly going to build new ships? But stay tuned. We'll see in just a couple of minutes. The other thing the United States did throughout the 1920s, both in 1924 and in 1929, was a series of massive bank loans to Germany. And Germany, if you remember, at the end of World War I and at the Paris Peace Conference, was assigned guilt for the war, and therefore was forced to pay England and France for suffering and damages, and those payments were known as reparations. The German economy was a mess after World War I, and they quickly ran out of money and were unable to pay reparations to Germany and France, to Britain and France, rather, excuse me. And the United States then began to send loans to Germany so that Germany could make its loan payments, or its reparations payments. So that being said, those payments were interrupted and in fact stopped after the 1929-1930 and the onset of the Great Depression, which is going to cause the European nations to feel the effects of the Depression even more, and then again to in some way abandon the idea of world peace that the United States was trying to do. And you might say, well, how is it that money and loan payments to Germany are promoting world peace? Well, the idea that Wilson had and future presidents had was that if the world were open to trade, and that would generate jobs, that would create prosperity, that would create a flow of wealth and goods around the world, that would make war less likely. So with the end of these loan payments, the end of reparations payments from Germany to Britain and France, and by the way, Britain and France also had huge loans to pay back to the United States for World War I. So that financial sort of cycle all comes screeching to a halt, and that's going to lead to obviously bad things. The last thing you see up there is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg was the United States Secretary of State. Briand was the French Foreign Minister. They arranged a pact, an agreement that is, that said all nations of the world, at least the developed nations of the world, would never go to war again. So really idealistic, big, ambitious plan to say that in the future, wars would be avoided and countries would find ways to settle their differences. So that is the backdrop. Now, your question is, how does this connect to World War II in any way? And here's how it does. Because of the economic chaos and misery and suffering of the people in the early 1930s, and that suffering spread to all corners of the globe, this really gave rise to a new class of political leader. And I'm going to call those political leaders totalitarian dictators. And if we go to the next slide, I think you can then see very clearly the impact of the Great Depression, the death of democracy in the 1930s, a worldwide phenomenon. So we're going to see the rise of leaders like Adolf Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan, Franco in Spain, Horthy in Hungary, and the list kind of goes on and on. So I think you get the point that across the globe, and especially in Europe and in Japan, we see this new type of leader, totalitarian dictator. And they were awfully charming people, a lot of charisma. They spoke with great emotional intensity, and they really promised the people of their nations, again, who were suffering from the Depression, they promised them better times. They promised them a better future, a brighter future with jobs, with economic stability and prosperity, and the return of greatness. So the idea of Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo is that they were going to make those nations great again. And you can think about the defeat of Germany in World War I. So Hitler's plan and purpose is really to erase the defeat in World War I and restore Germany to a position of power and dominance in Europe and in the world. Mussolini, much the same. Italy was among the victorious powers, but it really didn't contribute in a significant way, and Italy felt that it had been cheated at the peace conference. So Mussolini's idea is to restore Italy to the great glories of the Roman Empire of the past. Tojo wants to take Japan and make it a Southeast Asia dominant power, dominating the Pacific Ocean area. So those are the goals, and Franco and Horthy, although to lesser extents, have the same idea. So you can see the trend here, and this is really brought on by the Depression. So let's get to the next question then. When and where did World War II start? So there's another myth that somehow World War II started in Europe, and a lot of historians believe that we can date the beginning of World War II to China in 1931, in 1932. And we see that, again, Japan, led by this ambitious and militaristic military leader, that is, Tojo, had great plans for Japan. Japan is a tiny island nation that you can see there. It does not have a lot of resources. And as Japan began to build its industrial capacity and build its military might, it needed resources. And right next door to Japan, you can see they already controlled Korea as a colony, was China. And the northeastern region or province of China, named Manchuria, which you see in the map, held a lot of resources. So it was a resource-rich area that Japan was interested in. Japan had already built a railroad going from Vladivostok up into the Soviet Union, the USSR, and Japan ran and controlled that railroad. And what Japan did was they fabricated an attack. They said essentially that the Chinese had attacked this Japanese railway, killed some Japanese, and in retaliation, that Japan was then going to invade Manchuria, which they did. So the idea, and I put this in red, is that Japan fabricates an alleged attack. And that's really a lesson. I'd like to stop and just point out that we're going to see several times in the 20th century. In this case, it was Japan fabricating an attack. But later, we'll see that the United States fabricated attacks against us that were then used as a pretext or justification to launch wars. One thinks of Vietnam. One thinks of the recent Iraq War of 2003 that's now being discussed in our political arena with the upcoming 2016 presidential elections. One might think back to the war with Spain and one could even think about World War II in some way. So that's the idea. Japan fabricates this story. In fact, it was Japanese soldiers who actually attacked the Japanese railway and then covered it up and pretended that it was the Chinese. So interesting stuff, I think. So at any rate, Japan invades. And what's the result of this? Well, the result is that the United States rejects Japan's actions, and Secretary of State Stimson issues what is called now the Stimson Doctrine. And it was essentially a statement saying that the United States would not recognize and not accept Japan's actions, because Japan's actions had violated the idea of the open door that the United States had been practicing in terms of foreign relations for quite some time. Here's a picture of the open door with regards to China, and you can see Uncle Sam in front of an open door with the key. So the idea is that the United States unlocked the Chinese doors, opened them to the world for visitors and for businessmen. And that's the idea of the open door that goes back to the 1920s, and the idea of loaning money to Germany, etc., is that with open door policies, money and goods will flow freely. And again, think of the idea of free flow of money and goods throughout the world, and that would lead to peace and not war. Japan's actions clearly violate the United States idea of the open door policy. And the problem is that the United States was not willing to do anything to back up the Stimson Doctrine. And again, you might ask, well, why not? Well, because it's rather far away from the United States at the time, Southeast Asia, but also the Great Depression, again, had turned the attention and focus of our government inward, so that we did not really have time or the will or the desire to deal with the problems in the world. Yet we do make these big, broad statements. President Roosevelt also, when he becomes president in 1933, issues what's known as the good neighbor policy, that the United States wants itself to be a good neighbor and wants everybody else in the world to act as good neighbors. So these rather idealistic statements in the interest of protecting the free flow of money and trade and investments to produce prosperity. So moving on, we're going to see that the League of Nations, which was in fact created at the end of World War I, the United States never joined the League of Nations, but it did exist and it did operate. The League of Nations condemns the Japanese attacks on Manchuria, however, to no impact. In fact, the Japanese simply quit the League. They walk out and turn their backs on the international community. And then several years later, 5 years later, in 1937, full-scale war broke out between the Japanese and the Chinese. The Chinese lost that war and very quickly, and it was very sad and tragic. And you can see here why it was sad and tragic with this photograph. That's one of the iconic photographs of the Japanese attack of 1937 on mainland China, so the rest of China, and what Japan used, and this was going to become part of the 20th century military history, and that is aerial bombardment, which is indiscriminate and rains down death from the skies, destroying everything in its path. Now, today we like to think we have laser-guided bombs that avoid this kind of destruction and death. Not sure that's entirely the case, though better than it was then. You can see here the unfortunate survivor of one of the aerial attacks, this young baby who was left crying alone, obviously without any help at all, and kind of a sad story. And you're going to see this again in Spain. The Germans are going to use aerial bombardment, and we will see that. So, that being said, now Japan has really launched what becomes World War II, though it starts in Asia. And Japan is on the move militarily. And again, you might ask, well, why is Japan doing this? Well, again, Japan wants to acquire resources. They want to acquire land to provide food for its population. So the interests of the Japanese population trump the interest of the Chinese, and they're going to use military means, not discussion, conversation, and free trade to achieve it. And with that, I think we'll end this lecture. That's all for now. So stay tuned for future lectures. Thank you.